What if the deepest problem of human life is not suffering itself, but the way we have learned to interpret it? The quiet assumption that pain is a mistake, that existence must justify itself in terms of comfort, that a life filled with struggle somehow fails a hidden test we never agreed to take. And what if this assumption, so natural, so rarely questioned, is precisely where an entire tradition of thought begins to tighten around us? Because there is a long philosophical lineage that looks directly at life, strips away illusion, refuses consolation, and arrives at a conclusion that feels as cold as it is honest. Existence carries a cost, and that cost may outweigh its benefits. A conclusion you can trace through the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, who saw the world as driven by a blind, restless will that condemns every living being to an endless oscillation between desire and dissatisfaction. Through Emil Cioran, who transforms consciousness itself into a wound, a kind of awareness that makes life heavier the more clearly it is seen. And into the sharp, almost clinical reasoning of David Benatar, who argues that coming into existence is not a gift at all, but a harm imposed without consent. A risk no one is asked to take, yet everyone is forced to carry. And when you follow this line of thought far enough, when you allow it to unfold without interruption, without the usual reflex to escape into optimism, you arrive at a place where the question quietly shifts, where it no longer asks how to live well, but whether it would have been better not to live at all. And then, at that exact point, at the edge of that conclusion, someone like Friedrich Nietzsche enters the scene. Not to soften it, not to deny it, not to pretend that suffering can be erased or explained away, but to do something far more unsettling. To accept every premise, every observation, every uncomfortable truth that pessimism lays out, and still refuse its conclusion. Because Nietzsche does not argue that life is easy or fair or structured in a way that guarantees happiness. He does not offer comfort. He does not promise resolution. He does not rebuild meaning from outside the problem. Instead, he turns inward and asks a question that feels almost dangerous in its simplicity. What if suffering is not evidence against life, but a condition of its intensity? What if the weight of existence is not something to escape, but something to carry differently? And what if the real divide between pessimism and Nietzsche is not about whether life contains pain, but about what we do with it once we see it clearly? Because from this point forward, the discussion stops being abstract, it stops being distant, and it becomes something far more personal. Something that inevitably turns back toward the viewer, toward the one listening, toward the one thinking. If life demands suffering, would you reject it? Or would you learn to affirm it? This is where the real conflict begins. Before we can understand why Friedrich Nietzsche pushes so forcefully against pessimism, we have to sit with it long enough to feel its full weight, to see what it actually claims when it is allowed to speak without interruption, without being softened, without being translated into something more comfortable than it really is. Because philosophical pessimism is not a mood. It is not a temporary sadness. It is not the result of a bad day or a personal disappointment. It is a structured way of looking at existence itself, a conclusion reached not through emotion, but through reflection that refuses to look away. At its core, pessimism begins with a simple but deeply unsettling observation. Life, when examined without illusion, seems saturated with suffering in a way that no amount of pleasure fully cancels out. And this imbalance does not appear accidental or temporary. It appears woven into the very structure of being alive, into desire, into consciousness, into time itself. Because to exist as a conscious being means to want, to lack, to anticipate, to remember, to fear, to lose, and to repeat this cycle again and again without ever arriving at a final point of rest. This is where Arthur Schopenhauer builds his entire philosophy, grounding it in the idea that beneath everything we experience, there is a blind, aimless force he calls the will, a constant striving that has no final goal, no endpoint, no satisfaction that lasts, a force that drives every living being forward while simultaneously ensuring that fulfillment always slips away. Because the moment a desire is satisfied, another one takes its place, and in that movement, life reveals its rhythm, a pendulum, as he describes it, swinging endlessly between pain and boredom, where pain comes from wanting what we do not have, and boredom arrives the moment we get it, leaving us suspended between agitation and emptiness without resolution. And yet, Schopenhauer's conclusion does not remain isolated. It echoes, transforms, and deepens as it moves through other thinkers, taking on new tones while preserving the same underlying structure. Because when Emil Cioran looks at existence, he does not simply describe suffering, he intensifies it by turning awareness itself into a problem, into something almost unbearable, suggesting that the more clearly we see, the more impossible it becomes to participate in life without a kind of internal fracture, a distance from everything that once felt immediate, as if consciousness itself introduces a crack into reality, a crack that never fully closes. And then the argument sharpens even further, becoming almost surgical in the hands of David Benatar, who removes even the last emotional hesitation and replaces it with a stark asymmetry, an idea that reframes the entire question of existence in terms of harm, where the absence of pain is always good, even if there is no one to benefit from it, while the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is someone to miss it. Which leads to a conclusion that feels almost impossible to ignore once it is fully understood. Bringing someone into existence always introduces harm, while never bringing them into existence avoids that harm entirely without depriving anyone of anything. At this point, pessimism no longer feels like a perspective among others. It begins to look like a logical position that emerges from a certain way of thinking consistently applied, because each of these philosophers, in different ways, circles around the same realization, that existence carries a structural cost, and that cost does not disappear simply because we learn to cope with it, or reinterpret it, or distract ourselves from it. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that pessimism does not rely on extreme cases. It does not need tragedy, catastrophe, or rare suffering to make its point. It draws its force from ordinary life, from the repetition of small frustrations, quiet anxieties, gradual losses, and the slow accumulation of time that eventually leads every life, without exception, toward its end. Which is why, when pessimism reaches its full expression, the question it leaves behind is not dramatic. It is not shouted. It is almost silent in the way it settles into thought. If existence inevitably contains suffering, and if that suffering is not fully compensated by pleasure, then what exactly justifies continuing the process? And more sharply still, what justifies starting it? It is at this exact point where the argument feels most complete, most difficult to escape, where the weight of it seems to close every exit, that Friedrich Nietzsche steps in. Not to deny any of this, not to dismantle the observations themselves, but to challenge the direction they move in, to question the conclusion rather than the premises, and to ask whether something crucial has been misunderstood in the way suffering is being interpreted. And this is where the real divergence begins. When Friedrich Nietzsche confronts pessimism, he does something that feels almost disorienting at first, because he does not rush to reject it. He does not accuse it of exaggeration, and he certainly does not try to replace it with optimism. Instead, he leans into it. He accepts its sharpest observations, its most uncomfortable insights. And then, at the precise moment where pessimism expects agreement, he quietly shifts the ground beneath it by asking a question that changes the entire direction of the argument, without changing any of its visible parts. Because for pessimistic thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer, suffering is treated as evidence, as something that reveals a flaw in existence, a signal that something has gone wrong at the deepest level of reality. And from that interpretation, the conclusion follows naturally, almost inevitably, that reducing suffering must become the central aim. And if suffering cannot be reduced sufficiently, then existence itself begins to look like a mistake. Nietzsche does not dispute the presence of suffering. He does not attempt to soften it or reinterpret it as something pleasant. What he questions instead is the meaning assigned to it, the silent assumption that suffering is inherently negative in a way that demands justification. Because once that assumption is accepted, the entire pessimistic structure builds itself almost automatically, and every experience of pain becomes another piece of evidence reinforcing the same conclusion. But Nietzsche asks something far more radical, something that feels almost dangerous once it is taken seriously. What if suffering is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be understood differently? What if pain is not an argument against life, but a feature of the kind of life that is capable of intensity, growth, transformation, and depth? Because when Nietzsche looks at human experience, he does not see a system designed for comfort. He sees a field of forces, tensions, resistances, and struggles through which something like strength can emerge. And in this view, suffering is not an error in the system. It is part of the mechanism that makes anything meaningful possible. Because without resistance, there is no development. Without difficulty, there is no overcoming. And without overcoming, there is no sense of becoming something more than what one already is. This is why Nietzsche famously writes, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." A sentence that is often repeated, but rarely fully absorbed, because its implication runs deeper than motivation or resilience. It suggests that suffering does not need to disappear in order for life to be affirmed. It needs to be integrated into a broader structure of meaning that gives it direction. And yet, Nietzsche's position is not as simple as saying suffering is good, because that would reduce his argument to another form of moral labeling, another attempt to categorize experience in terms of approval or rejection. Instead, what he is doing is dismantling the framework that demands such categories in the first place. He is stepping outside the assumption that life must justify itself according to human standards of comfort, happiness, or fairness. In this sense, Nietzsche is not answering pessimism. He is reframing the question it asks. Pessimism looks at suffering and asks, how can this be justified? Nietzsche looks at the same suffering and asks, what does this make possible? And that shift, subtle as it may seem at first, changes everything. Because once suffering is no longer treated as evidence against existence, the entire weight of the pessimistic argument begins to loosen. Not because it has been disproven, but because its foundation, the interpretation of suffering as a flaw, has been called into question. This is also where Nietzsche begins to move toward one of his most provocative ideas. The notion that a life fully affirmed would be a life one would be willing to live again, in exactly the same way, with every pain, every loss, every failure included. An idea he later develops into the concept of eternal recurrence, not as a literal cosmological claim, but as a test of one's relationship to existence itself. Because if the thought of reliving your life endlessly feels unbearable, then something in your relationship to life remains unresolved. Something resists affirmation at the deepest level. And pessimism, in this light, begins to look less like a final truth and more like a symptom of that resistance. And this is where Nietzsche's challenge becomes personal, because it no longer asks whether suffering exists, or even whether it dominates life. It asks something much harder. can you affirm a life that includes it? Or does your rejection of suffering quietly become a rejection of life itself? From here, Nietzsche's critique deepens, because he begins to suspect that pessimism is not simply a philosophical conclusion, but an expression of something more psychological, more rooted in the way we respond to weakness, exhaustion, and the desire to escape. And this is where his analysis turns sharper, more uncomfortable, and far more difficult to ignore. Because the next question is no longer about suffering. It is about the kind of person who interprets it in a particular way. And that is where things begin to cut deeper. At this stage, Friedrich Nietzsche takes a step that makes his entire critique far more uncomfortable than it first appears, because he no longer treats pessimism as a purely logical position that emerges from neutral observation. He begins to look beneath it, into the psychological conditions that give rise to it, into the temperament, the internal state, the kind of life that makes such conclusions feel not only convincing, but almost inevitable. And in so doing, he shifts the discussion from arguments to instincts, from reasoning to the deeper currents that shape how reasoning itself unfolds. Because for Nietzsche, ideas do not exist in isolation. They are not detached from the bodies and minds that produce them. They carry the imprint of lived experience, of strength or fatigue, of vitality or decline. And this means that a philosophy can be both logically consistent and psychologically revealing at the same time. It can be true in its observations while still pointing to something unresolved in the one who holds it. This is where Nietzsche introduces one of his most controversial intuitions, the suspicion that pessimism, in many cases, reflects a kind of exhaustion, a weariness with life that seeks justification, not merely understanding. A state in which suffering is no longer something to be engaged with, transformed, or overcome, but something that calls for an exit, for a reduction, for a quiet withdrawal from the demands that life imposes. And here, his disagreement with Arthur Schopenhauer becomes especially sharp, because while Schopenhauer sees the will as something to be denied, something to be quieted, something that traps us in endless striving, Nietzsche sees in that very will the possibility of creation, of expansion, of self-overcoming, and what appears as torment in one framework begins to look like raw material in another, depending on how it is approached. From this perspective, pessimism starts to take on a different meaning. It begins to look less like a final verdict on existence and more like a response to it, a way of interpreting suffering that leans toward negation, toward minimizing exposure, toward protecting oneself from further harm by stepping back from engagement altogether. And while this response is understandable, even human in a deep sense, Nietzsche refuses to grant it philosophical authority simply because it feels compelling. He asks, quietly but persistently, what kind of life seeks to reduce itself? What kind of instinct prefers silence over struggle? And more provocatively still, what if the desire to escape suffering is also a desire to escape growth? Because in Nietzsche's framework, suffering is not only something that happens to us, it is something that interacts with our capacity to respond, to shape, to reinterpret, to push back against limits. And this is where he introduces the idea of the will to power, not as domination over others, but as an internal drive toward expansion, toward becoming more than one currently is, a force that expresses itself through creation, through resistance, through the refusal to collapse under pressure. In this light, pessimism begins to appear as a contraction of that will, a narrowing, a turning inward that seeks relief rather than transformation. And Nietzsche sees in this movement a deeper danger, not because it is false in every respect, but because it risks closing off the very processes through which life gains intensity, depth, and significance. This is also why Nietzsche is so critical of philosophical systems that elevate resignation into a virtue, that present withdrawal as wisdom, that transform the reduction of desire into a kind of moral achievement. Because to him, these systems do not solve the problem of suffering, they avoid it by lowering the stakes of existence itself, by asking less of life in order to feel less from it. And here, without naming it directly, Nietzsche's critique extends beyond Schopenhauer into a broader tradition of thought that treats non-existence, or the minimization of existence, as a kind of solution, a direction that will later be expressed with striking clarity in thinkers like David Benatar, where the argument becomes almost mathematical in its structure, reducing the question of life to a balance sheet of harm and benefit, and concluding that the safest course is to avoid the risk altogether. But Nietzsche resists this movement at its root, because for him, life is not something that can be evaluated from the outside, as if it were a problem to be solved once and for all. It is something that must be lived through, shaped from within, affirmed or rejected in the very act of experiencing it. And any philosophy that attempts to step outside that process risks losing contact with what makes life dynamic in the first place. This is why Nietzsche's critique of pessimism is not simply theoretical, it is existential. It reaches into the way one stands in relation to existence, into whether one contracts or expands in the face of difficulty, into whether one seeks to minimize pain or to transform it into something that can be carried, even used. And this leads to a deeper tension, one that cannot be resolved by argument alone. Is pessimism a clear-eyed recognition of reality, or is it a form of retreat disguised as insight? Because from here, Nietzsche's response moves into even more challenging territory, where he begins to ask whether the rejection of suffering is also a rejection of life's creative potential, and whether true affirmation requires something far more demanding than comfort, something that calls for a complete reorientation of how we understand value itself. And that is where his most radical ideas begin to take shape. At this point, Friedrich Nietzsche no longer limits himself to analyzing pessimism or exposing its psychological roots. He begins to construct something in its place, something far more demanding than optimism, far more difficult than resignation, a stance that does not ask for comfort, that does not promise relief, and that does not soften the weight of existence, but instead asks for a complete transformation in how one relates to that weight. A transformation captured in a phrase that sounds simple until it is truly considered. Amor, Fati, the love of fate. Not acceptance in the passive sense, not endurance in the quiet sense, but something much more radical. A willingness to embrace everything that has happened, everything that is happening, and everything that will happen, without remainder, without silent resentment, without the hidden wish that reality had unfolded differently. Because for Nietzsche, the deepest form of affirmation is not found in selecting the parts of life that feel good, but in affirming the totality of it, including everything that wounds, disrupts, and unsettles. This is where his position moves far beyond anything offered by pessimism, because thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer see suffering and conclude that desire must be reduced, that the will must be quieted, that peace lies in stepping back from the intensity of life, while Nietzsche looks at the same suffering and asks whether one can go further in the opposite direction, whether one can not only endure it, not only justify it, but actually affirm it as part of the fabric of existence that makes everything else possible. And this is not a poetic gesture, it is not a rhetorical flourish designed to inspire, it is a test, a brutal one. Because to say yes to life in this way means saying yes to every loss, every failure, every moment of pain that cannot be undone or rewritten. It means giving up the idea that life owes us compensation, balance, or fairness, and instead meeting it on its own terms, without negotiation. Nietzsche pushes this idea even further through one of his most unsettling thought experiments, the concept of eternal recurrence, where he asks us to imagine that every moment of our life will repeat endlessly, exactly as it has occurred, without alteration, without escape. And the question he poses is not whether this is true in a physical sense, but how one responds to it, because that response reveals something fundamental about one's relationship to existence. Would you recoil at the thought? Would you feel crushed by it? Or could you reach a point where you would say, without hesitation, that you would live it again, not because it was easy, not because it was pleasant, but because it was yours? This is where Amor Fati becomes something more than an idea. It becomes a measure, a way of testing the depth of one's affirmation. Because loving fate does not mean enjoying every moment. It means refusing to divide life into acceptable and unacceptable parts. It means seeing even the most difficult experiences as inseparable from the whole that one ultimately affirms. And here, Nietzsche's distance from pessimism becomes absolute, because pessimism seeks to reduce exposure to suffering, to minimize harm, to step back from the conditions that produce pain, while Nietzsche moves in the opposite direction, toward a fuller engagement with those conditions, toward a life that risks more, feels more, and therefore suffers more, but also gains a kind of intensity that cannot be reached through avoidance. This is why his philosophy often feels dangerous, even reckless, because it removes the protective layer that pessimism provides, the layer that says, step back, reduce, withdraw, and replaces it with something far less secure, a demand to confront existence without guarantees, without safety nets, without the expectation that things will resolve in a way that justifies the struggle. And yet, for Nietzsche, this is precisely where life becomes most fully itself, because meaning is not something given from the outside, not something embedded in the structure of the universe waiting to be discovered. It is something created through engagement, through the way one responds to what is given, through the act of shaping one's relationship to necessity. This is also where his famous line begins to take on its full weight. Become who you are. A statement that at first sounds like self-expression, but in this context becomes something far more demanding. Because to become who you are means to take responsibility for everything that has shaped you, everything that has marked you, everything that has brought you to this point, and to affirm it, not as something that should have been different, but as something that belongs to you completely. And this is the point where many hesitate, where the idea of loving fate begins to feel almost impossible, because it asks for something that goes against a deeply ingrained instinct, the instinct to resist pain, to rewrite the past, to imagine alternative versions of life that would have been easier, cleaner, more manageable. But Nietzsche's response is unyielding. To wish for a different past is to fragment oneself. To reject what has been is to weaken what is. And so the question becomes unavoidable. Can one reach a point where nothing needs to be undone? Because if such a point exists, it represents something far beyond pessimism and far beyond optimism. It represents a way of standing in relation to existence that does not depend on reducing suffering or escaping it, but on transforming one's entire orientation toward it. And from here, Nietzsche's argument moves toward its most difficult implication of all. Because if life is to be affirmed in its entirety, then the question of whether existence should continue, whether it should be created again and again, begins to take on a completely new meaning. And this is where his confrontation with thinkers like David Benatar becomes unavoidable. At this stage, Friedrich Nietzsche directs the discussion towards something even more fundamental than suffering, something that quietly underlies both pessimism and optimism, something so deeply embedded in the way we think that it often passes unnoticed. And that is the assumption that life must justify itself, that existence must somehow present a reason, a purpose, a final explanation that makes everything acceptable, bearable, meaningful in a way that satisfies the mind. Because once this assumption is in place, the entire structure of pessimism begins to make sense. The arguments of David Benatar, Wessel Zapffe, Emil Cioran, and Philipp Mainländer all begin from a similar starting point, even when they diverge in tone or method, because each, in different language, measures life against a certain expectation, an implicit standard according to which existence must deliver more good than harm, more coherence than chaos, more fulfillment than frustration. And when it fails to meet that standard, the conclusion follows naturally. Something has gone wrong at the level of existence itself. And yet, Nietzsche's move here is not to argue that life actually meets this standard. He does not attempt to prove that suffering is outweighed by joy. He does not construct a balance sheet in which existence comes out ahead, because that entire way of thinking already accepts the premise that life is something to be evaluated from the outside, as if one could step beyond it and weigh its value objectively. And this is precisely what Nietzsche begins to dismantle. He asks, quietly but with increasing force, who decided that life must justify itself? Who set the terms of this evaluation? And perhaps more importantly, from where are we making this judgment? Because any attempt to evaluate life necessarily takes place within life itself, from a perspective that is already shaped by the very thing it is trying to judge, which means that the demand for justification carries a hidden contradiction. It assumes a position outside existence that no one can actually occupy, a vantage point from which life could be assessed as a whole, approved or rejected, accepted or denied. This is where Nietzsche's critique cuts deepest, because he does not merely reject pessimism's conclusion, he challenges its starting point, the idea that existence must answer to a tribunal of reason, that it must provide a final account of itself that satisfies human expectations. And in doing so, he begins to dissolve the entire framework within which pessimism operates. For Arthur Schopenhauer, suffering reveals something essential about the nature of the will, leading to a philosophy that seeks quieting, reduction, a stepping back from desire. While for Benatar, the asymmetry between pain and pleasure leads to a moral argument against bringing new life into existence. And for Zapffe, consciousness itself becomes an evolutionary excess that forces the mind into strategies of avoidance. And for Cioran, awareness turns existence into a kind of ongoing astonishment tinged with despair. Each of these perspectives carries a certain clarity, a refusal to look away from the darker aspects of existence. And Nietzsche recognizes this. He does not dismiss their observations as naive or superficial, but he sees in all of them a shared commitment to a question that he ultimately refuses to accept. Is life worth it? Because for Nietzsche, this question itself already signals a withdrawal, a movement away from life into evaluation, into judgment, into a position that seeks to stand above existence rather than within it. And once that movement is made, the answer tends to follow a predictable path. Because life, measured against absolute standards of meaning or fairness, will almost always appear lacking. Instead of answering this question, Nietzsche proposes something far more radical, the refusal to ask it in the first place. Not as an act of ignorance, but as a deliberate rejection of the framework that demands justification. Because life, in his view, is not something that needs to be validated externally. It is something that expresses itself, unfolds, creates, destroys, transforms, without reference to a final purpose that must be articulated in order to make it legitimate. This is where the tension between Nietzsche and the pessimists becomes irreconcilable. Because while they seek a verdict, he seeks an orientation. While they ask whether existence should continue, he asks how one stands in relation to its continuation. And in this shift, the entire problem changes shape. Because once the demand for justification is set aside, suffering no longer functions as evidence against life in the same way. It becomes part of a larger process that does not aim at equilibrium or comfort, but at intensity, at transformation, at the continuous overcoming of limits. And this does not make suffering disappear. It does not redeem it in a moral sense, but it places it within a different horizon, one where its presence does not automatically lead to negation. And yet, this move raises a new and unavoidable question, one that cannot be dismissed so easily. If life does not need to justify itself, what then guides our response to it? What determines whether we affirm it or turn away? Because at this point, Nietzsche's philosophy reaches a threshold, where the rejection of pessimism is no longer enough, and something else must take its place, something that defines what it means to live without the demand for external meaning, without the expectation of final answers, without the comfort of justification. And this is where his idea of the Übermensch begins to emerge, not as a figure of domination, but as a response to this very absence, a way of creating value where none is given, of shaping meaning where none is guaranteed. And that is where the final movement of this argument begins. At this point, Friedrich Nietzsche reaches a threshold where analysis no longer carries the weight of the argument forward on its own, because once the demand that life justify itself has been set aside, once the question, is life worth it, has been quietly removed from its central position, something else must take its place, something that does not retreat into silence, does not collapse into indifference, and does not fall back into inherited meanings, but instead begins to actively shape what meaning itself will be. And this is where the idea of the Übermensch emerges. Not as a mythic figure standing above humanity, not as a final stage of evolution, but as a way of responding to a world that offers no ready-made answers. Because what Nietzsche sees with unsettling clarity is that once traditional foundations lose their authority, once religious guarantees fade and metaphysical certainties dissolve, a kind of vacuum appears, a space in which the absence of given meaning can either become paralyzing or become creative. And this is precisely where his path diverges most sharply from the pessimistic thinkers who stand on the other side of this same realization. For David Benatar, this absence reinforces the asymmetry at the heart of existence, the idea that bringing life into the world introduces avoidable harm, and that the most responsible position may lie in restraint, in limiting the continuation of suffering rather than attempting to reinterpret it. While for Wessel Zapffe, the same absence intensifies the sense that human consciousness has exceeded its adaptive role, leaving us with an awareness too vast for the conditions in which it must operate, forcing the mind into strategies that shield it from its own depth. Emil Cioran lingers in that space with a kind of lucid exhaustion, circling the strange persistence of existence without resolving it into either affirmation or denial, while Philipp Mainländer translates the entire movement into a metaphysical narrative of decline, where existence itself unfolds toward its own negation, as if the deepest logic of being were to undo itself. Each of these responses follows a certain coherence once the absence of objective meaning is accepted. Each draws a line from that absence toward reduction, toward withdrawal, toward the minimization of harm or the quiet acknowledgement of futility. And Nietzsche sees all of this, understands its internal logic, and yet refuses to follow it, because for him, the absence of given meaning does not close the question, it opens it. The Übermensch is the name he gives to this opening, not as a solution in the conventional sense, but as a direction, a movement away from dependence on inherited values and toward the creation of new ones, values that do not claim universal validity, that do not pretend to resolve the structure of reality, but that arise from the act of living itself, from the way one engages with existence in its full intensity. This is why the concept is so often misunderstood, because it is not about superiority in a social or biological sense. It is about responsibility, about taking upon oneself the task that was once assigned to external authorities, the task of giving shape to meaning in a world that no longer provides it. And this is where Nietzsche's position becomes both liberating and unsettling at the same time, Because the removal of objective meaning does not lead to emptiness in his view. It leads to a different kind of demand. A demand that each individual confront the question of value directly, without relying on tradition, without appealing to transcendence, without expecting validation from anything beyond life itself. In this sense, the Übermensch stands in direct contrast to the pessimistic trajectory represented by Benatar, Zapffe, Cioran, and Mainlander, because where they see the absence of meaning as a reason to reduce or reconsider existence, Nietzsche sees it as the condition that makes creation possible, as the very space in which new forms of life, new interpretations, new intensities can emerge. But this creation is not arbitrary. It is not a matter of inventing comforting illusions or constructing pleasant narratives, because Nietzsche's philosophy carries a certain severity, a refusal to soften reality in order to make it more acceptable. And this is what makes his position so demanding, because to create values under these conditions means to do so without guarantees, without the assurance that they are justified in any ultimate sense. And yet, this is precisely where his answer to pessimism takes its final shape. Not by denying suffering, not by outweighing it with pleasure, but by transforming the role it plays within existence. By refusing to let it function as a final argument against life, and instead incorporating it into a broader process of becoming, a process in which difficulty, tension, and even pain contribute to the intensity of experience rather than simply diminishing it. This is also why Nietzsche's thought often resists simple categorization, because it does not offer comfort in the traditional sense. It does not promise resolution. It does not conclude with a stable answer that can be easily summarized or adopted. Instead, it leaves the individual in a position of ongoing engagement, where meaning must be continually shaped, continually tested, continually lived. And at this point, the distance between Nietzsche and the pessimists becomes complete, not because they disagree about the facts of existence, but because they respond to those facts in fundamentally different ways. One turning toward reduction, the other toward creation. One seeking to minimize harm, the other seeking to intensify life. And this leaves us with a final, unavoidable question. One that cannot be answered abstractly. One that cannot be settled through argument alone. What does one do with a life that offers no final justification, no guaranteed meaning, no external validation? Because from here, the discussion no longer belongs entirely to philosophy. It turns toward the individual. And that is where the final section begins. At this final point, the discussion no longer moves outward into systems, arguments, or historical frameworks. It folds inward towards something far less abstract and far more immediate. Because after Friedrich Nietzsche has dismantled the demand that life justify itself, after he has pushed against the conclusions of pessimism and opened the possibility of value creation through the idea of the Übermensch, what remains is not a theory waiting to be accepted, but a question waiting to be lived. A question that does not ask for agreement, but for orientation. Because everything that has been said up to this point, every argument from Arthur Schopenhauer, every diagnosis from Peter Wessel Zapffe, every lucid reflection from Emil Cioran, every metaphysical conclusion from Philipp Mainländer, and every structured argument from David Benatar ultimately converges on a single pressure point, a place where thought can no longer remain detached from life itself. Because pessimism, in all its forms, carries a certain clarity, a refusal to disguise suffering, a willingness to confront the asymmetries, the limitations, the fragility that define existence. And in this sense, it performs an essential function. It strips away illusion. It removes the easy narratives that promise balance or fairness. It exposes the raw structure of experience without decoration. And yet, Once that exposure has taken place, once the illusions have been set aside, something else must follow. Because remaining at that point indefinitely leads to a kind of paralysis, a state in which every action becomes questionable, every continuation becomes suspect, every creation becomes shadowed by the question of whether it should occur at all. This is where Nietzsche's divergence becomes final, because he does not attempt to resolve pessimism through counter-argument. He does not try to prove that life contains more pleasure than pain. He does not construct a defense of existence based on calculation or balance. Instead, he shifts the entire terrain of the discussion, moving away from evaluation and toward affirmation. Not blind affirmation, not naive optimism, but something far more difficult, something that requires confronting everything that has been revealed by pessimism and still choosing to stand within life rather than outside it. And this is where the question becomes unavoidable. What does it mean to affirm life, knowing everything that has been said? Because affirmation, in Nietzsche's sense, does not erase suffering. It does not reinterpret it as secretly beneficial. It does not promise that everything will lead to some higher resolution. Instead, it consists in refusing to let suffering dictate the final meaning of existence, refusing to let it function as a verdict, and instead placing it within a larger act of engagement, an ongoing process of becoming that does not seek completion. For thinkers like Benatar, the conclusion leads toward restraint, toward the reduction of future suffering through the refusal to bring new life into existence. For Zapffe, it leads toward strategies that limit exposure to the full weight of consciousness. For Cioran, it circles endlessly around the tension between lucidity and continuation. And for Mainlander, it unfolds into a vision of existence as a movement toward its own dissolution. Each of these paths follows a certain internal consistency. Each responds to the same underlying recognition, and each, in its own way, attempts to resolve the tension between awareness and existence. Nietzsche's path does something different. It refuses resolution. It refuses closure. It refuses the idea that existence must culminate in a final answer that settles the question once and for all. Instead, it leaves the question open, not as a weakness, but as a condition of life itself. Because a closed system may offer certainty, but it also removes the possibility of creation, of transformation, of becoming something other than what has already been determined. And so, the final movement of this argument does not arrive at a conclusion in the traditional sense. It does not deliver a statement that can be accepted or rejected. It leaves something unfinished, something unresolved, something that extends beyond the boundaries of the video itself. Because in the end, the question does not belong to Nietzsche. It does not belong to Schopenhauer, or Benatar, or Cioran, or Zapffe, or Mainlander. It belongs to the one who is listening. To stand within existence, aware of its weight, aware of its uncertainty, aware of its lack of guarantees, and still continue, or to turn away, to reduce, to refuse, to step back from what cannot be justified, neither path disappears. Neither path can be dismissed. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the decision is not made once. It repeats, quietly, in different forms, across an entire life. If you have stayed until this point, then this question has already reached you, whether clearly or quietly, whether consciously or somewhere beneath the surface. And maybe that is enough. Because some questions are not meant to be answered quickly. Some questions are meant to remain, to return, to shape the way one looks at everything else. And perhaps that is where thinking truly begins. See you in the next one.